We've been talking here at this point in time about a consideration again of the use of divine names, and mentioned that they are never written helter-skelter, never used helter-skelter in the Old Testament. Instead, every time you see a name, it's there purposefully to indicate something, not necessarily mystical, and some people get all into all that kind of thing, but it's certainly something that is applicable to that particular text. So we'd say, to continue, in the narrative literature, that is the narrative portions of the Pentateuch, which would be, as we've said, the former prophets, Joshua, 2 Kings, Jonah, the narrative portion of Job in the narrative literature, the name Yahweh is used. May I write up here how the name for that? It's called the Tetragrammaton from Greek, and that's just too juicy a name to leave off here. Tetragrammaton, a fancy word for saying a 4-letter word. That's an N out there, Tetragrammaton. If you can pronounce that at church banquets, why, you'll really impress your friends, I'm sure. The Tetragrammaton is the YHWH. That's the 4 letters, and or YHVH if you prefer. Either one is right. And in that literature we're talking about here, former prophets, Jonah, and so forth, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, and Elohim are both used in close proximity. Can you imagine what the problem is that you'd see with the liberals if you say Yahweh Elohim? That means the J writer and the E writer were right there, 2 words apart. And yet somehow, you see, that just defeats the whole thing. You can't say that somebody wrote a J passage when you have the divine names put right next to each other, and that happens frequently. So it's strange. So, we say about this, where the subject matter is of Israelite character, talking about Israel and the way the Lord loved them, Yahweh is used. Where the subject matter is of wider scope out to the nations and so forth, Elohim is employed. Again, may I say, Yahweh is up close and personal to the Old Testament people. In your prayers, Yahweh is up close and personal to you. And Elohim is the great term that's used for the God of creation. And that's simply 2 names. There are many more names for God, as we know. And it doesn't mean different gods, and it certainly doesn't mean different writers. So they had some other things that they tried to do. They had the supplementary hypothesis. You probably don't need to write this down. That was held by some scholars. E is basic in this approach, and J supplants it. So now you've got something like this. And there are actually people that still hold some of these things. Here's E, that's basic. And then little bits and pieces of J come in here when Yahweh is used. After a while, you start seeing double or triple or something. And that would be a supplementary hypothesis. There was a crystallization hypothesis about 1840 that meant that several contributors reworked the total. After a while, you start seeing things that aren't there, right? And the fragmentary hypothesis, which had many J's and many E's, that also came up. I want to stop here and talk about the persistence of the theory. And this is something that's kind of close to me because I heard this man speak years ago in England. This is from H.H. Rowley, The Growth of the Old Testament. Now, just follow the reasoning here. He says in about, this would have been somewhere in the 50s and later, 60s, 70s, it is sometimes supposed that the Graf-Wellhausen view is universally discredited and rejected from all of the heat that they took at one time. That it is widely rejected in whole or in part is doubtless true. What a confession. It is widely rejected in whole or in part is doubtless true. But to them, there is no view to put in its place that would not be more widely and emphatically rejected. It's like saying that would certainly another view or a better view in its place would make the liberal unbeliever even more angry. Few of the rival views have won any adherents at all. While the Graf-Wellhausen view has still a respectable following. I don't know how respectable they are today. I mean, in our minds as Christians. Before it can be discarded, a view as complete and thoroughgoing. Oh, really? It sure was. It thoroughly mashed everything. Taking account of all the facts and related to the history will have to be provided. A mere concentration on the acknowledged difficulties of the Graf-Wellhausen view, and then on a selection of points that may seem to give support to a rival view will not do. He's just hanging on as much as he can. For none of the rival views can accommodate so many of the facts or can escape far more difficulties than the view it seeks to replace. Boy. Yet having said this, it remains true that the Graf-Wellhausen view is only a working hypothesis after all this, and he's going to say that. A working hypothesis. Man's been shaken, his knees are shaking. Which can be abandoned with alacrity when a more satisfying view is found, but which cannot with profit be abandoned till then. See? He's saying that's the only way that this can be ever resolved in his mind. So he's hanging on to this old view in spite of everything. Well, how should we characterize the trend of 20th century scholarship in its treatment of Pentateuchal criticism and of the Wellhausen hypothesis? At the very least, it must be regarded as a period of reaction against the neat, tight structure erected by the documentary theory of the 19th century. Almost every pillar has been shaken and shattered by a generation of scholars who were brought up on the Graf-Wellhausen system and yet have found it inadequate to explain the data of the Pentateuch. You want to explain the data. At the same time, it must be recognized that for the most part, even those scholars who have repudiated Wellhausen have shown no tendency to embrace a more conservative view of the origin of the books of Moses. They have determined the defenses, undermined the defenses, and torn down the bastions which buttressed the documentary hypothesis. But they left the OT in shambles. That's the problem. And they have gravitated quite definitely to an even more implausible position than that occupied by their predecessors. Despite the analogy of Israel's pagan neighbors and contemporaries who embodied their religious beliefs in written scriptures long before Moses' time, the Hebrews never got around to inscripturating the records of their faith until 500 BC later, and that's what they think we should know or do. It requires a tremendous willingness to believe the unlikely for an investigator to come up with a conclusion like that. And taken that last bit from Gleason Archer's Survey of Old Testament, page 104. So, as a conservative Bible expositor, what is the shape or position of the liberal enemy when it comes to source criticism today? And here's what we've got. If we have enough time to put it on the board, I jumped over a number of these different views that men have tried to put into print, all these little variations, and it's such an obvious scrambling to try to come up with something that they can agree on, and they're like running scared, from the Lord himself. This is Who Wrote the Bible, The question I'm asking, who wrote the Bible is the title of the book. This is from Richard Friedman at the University of California, San Diego. And it's 1987 now. And so here's what he's come up with. And be surprised how this is still hanging around. He would say, plus or minus 950 BC, the J writer. Who was the J writer? He's an unknown person from Judah, an advocate of the Davidic royal house. Get politics in there, if nothing else failed. Unknown. No one would read the words of an unknown person and call it scripture. 850 BC, the E-writer, an unknown person from Israel, Judah the first one, so the southern kingdom, then the northern kingdom, advocate of the priestly family of Shiloh. Where did they get that? I don't know. Plus or minus 700 BC, and we have the priestly writer, and he is, he favors Aaron the high priest. And his is an alternative to J.E. So you put J.E. up here, and he would be an alternative to J.E. in the time of Hezekiah. That's about a little further down, plus or minus 570 BC versus the 570 BC of Wellhausen. So he's at 700. 622 BC, look what's still hanging around. This is, of course, D, the old D, they're going to call it the old D, found or written then, around 622 BC. We've called that the pious fraud. Then we've got, I guess we won't be able to finish this in the time allotted. So we're about halfway down, and I will be back in a little bit to complete this page.